Roger Haywood, please remain seated until I tell you to stand. You pleaded guilty in the Magistrates' Court on the 9th of August to violent disorder, having on the 5th of August pleaded guilty to 2 offences of assaulting an emergency worker. All of those offences were committed on the 3rd of August. You will, of course, receive full credit for your guilty pleas. Those offences were committed against the background of widespread disorder across the region and indeed the country in the wake of the tragic killing of 3 young girls in Southport. One cannot begin to imagine the grief and the despair suffered by the families of those young children killed and indeed injured. People from all communities who make up the British public offered solidarity by either laying flowers, standing in peaceful condolence, or by silently and respectfully holding the bereaved families in their hearts and in their prayers. Whereas others, such as you, decided to usurp this terrible incident as an excuse for mindless, drunken thuggery. Earlier that week, there had already been serious disorder following the events in Southport, so everyone knew that so-called demonstrations were merely pretexts for violence and expressions of hate. There was no political, no ideological basis for taking to the streets. And so on the 3rd of August, the people of Blackpool and the Lancashire police were braced for violence, and you, along with several hundreds of other people, were on the streets that day, ready to cause injury and disorder. It was a sunny Saturday in the school holidays. In the course of the disorder, racist language was used, and 1 person suffered serious injury, though you were not present when that serious injury was caused. I will summarise what you did as appears from the statements and from the video footage. In a narrow pedestrianised retail area, there was a noisy scene and a highly volatile situation as an angry group, including you, confronted police officers. You repeatedly approached the police line, jabbing a finger at them and ignoring their many requests to move away. Next, you were seen leading a large group down the promenade. Some had flags, some had their faces covered. You were at the front with your hands above your head, turning round to beckon them on. You were clearly in the lead. You led this large group into a pedestrianised shopping area where there were families with young children. The group you led had fallen behind, but you turned and called them on. One pushed over a sign as he went along. One who was right next to you carried a red chair and hit out at a rope barrier as another kicked at it. These people were right next to you. This was a very ugly, intimidating scene with you in the lead. On a separate video, you were seen at one point remonstrating with a group across a police line. At one point, you tried to push through that line head first. You had to be physically pushed back by police officers on 2 occasions. You and the mob you had led went into the confined space of an indoor shopping centre. Again, you were raising your hands above your head. Brave security staff, vastly outnumbered, accompanied the group to try and ensure order and protect shoppers and staff. Members of the public were getting out of the way. The staff at JD Sports were trying to bring down the shutters in response to the disorder, but you and others tried to stop the shutter going down. 2 members of the security team intervened, and you turned on one, Security Officer Hart, and pushed him aggressively before trying to set about him. In the event, others took over the attack you had started, and you were pushed away. We know what happened next from the statement of Security Officer Hart. He described how the man we'd seen earlier with the red chair threw it towards the security officers. Another person stopped it hitting them. Security Officer Hart himself was pushed against the shutters and hit several times. He had to cover his head to protect himself. One man threw punches at him, and another took hold of his clothing and hit him repeatedly to the face. He sustained unpleasant injuries, though thankfully he wasn't seriously hurt. But it must have been a terrifying experience for him and the other security staff present. Of course, you didn't perpetrate all of the violence against security officer Hart, but where you lead a mob and encourage them and start violence, you cannot then seek to cast the blame on others, and to be fair to you, you haven't sought to do that. Because when you join in mob violence, you bear your share of the responsibility for what the mob does. What happened next is again the subject of video footage. You were then seen close to the cenotaph. There was a large group of people, many of whom, including you, were chanting. There was a line of police officers keeping order. At one stage, you put yourself at close quarters with police officers, wagging your finger and threatening them. You can be heard demanding to approach the cenotaph, and you react badly to being told that you may not do so. And you tell the officers that they were outnumbered, 10 to 1, as you put it, making an unmistakable threat to them. What you did next was unforgivably dangerous. Behind you was a group of angry, shouting people. However, they were at a significant distance from the police lines. You chose to turn your back on the police and face the mob. You shouted to them to the effect that the police would not let you through, and then with your arms you beckoned them on to breach the police lines. The crowd moved forward in response, and we hear the shout of missiles as at least one item was thrown at the police. Your aim was clear. You wanted to create a serious, violent and dangerous incident. Despite the obvious danger to them, the officers were completely professional. Thanks to their skill and professionalism, and despite your best efforts, your actions did not result in serious injury to others at that time. Following that part of the incident, it was clear that you still regarded yourself as a leader. You took a loud hailer from another person and tried to make your voice heard again, but were apparently too intoxicated to work out how to use the loud hailer. From the statements of the officers, we know that as the police returned to their van, you were seen in the middle of a scuffle, throwing punches. You tried to run away, but were tackled to the floor and arrested. When the police officers tried to put you in the van, you refused, bracing your legs and shouting abuse. You kicked out at the officers, landing 2 kicks on one officer's hand and 1 to another officer's arm. Thankfully, no significant injury was caused to those officers. Those kicks are represented by the offences of assaulting an emergency worker. Understand, please, assaults on police officers in any circumstances are unacceptable. In these circumstances, they were particularly serious. The impact to the community of what happened that day is set out in the statements I've received from the Council, the National Health Service and businesses in Blackpool. Of course, this disorder had a financial impact upon those services and businesses, but the emphasis of those statements, quite properly, is the impact of the disorder upon their service users and their customers and other people going about their lawful business. But it's clear that there was significant community impact evidenced by those statements. I've also received a statement from the Chief Constable of Lancashire, who speaks on behalf of her officers present that day. She makes the point that officers deployed in Blackpool that day were diverted from other essential duties. But the Chief Constable makes the further point that those officers are, of course, officers of the law, but are also people with families who should be able to go to work without being pelted with missiles, kicked and shouted at. They are, as she points out correctly, victims like anyone else. I turn to your personal circumstances. You're 41. Despite a spate of early offending, including offences of violence, you did not offend between 2013 and 2022. However, since then there have been offences of being drunk and disorderly and stalking, for which you received a community order which you subsequently breached. You tell me through your counsel, and I accept, that you have suffered recent illness, the loss of a relationship, that you have developed a problem with alcohol. She tells me that you are sorry and wish to apologise to those affected. Stand up, please. The law-abiding people of this country as a whole, and those directly involved in the tragic events in Southport in particular, will be bewildered and revolted that you somehow decided to treat those events as a pretext for what you did. Today, you must face up to the consequences of those actions. Everyone must understand that if you engage in this sort of mob violence, you will receive significant punishment. I follow the guidelines for violent disorder. This case falls within culpability A. You were an instigator and a leader in significant parts of what happened. However, others of the culpability A factors are not present, which must affect the position within the bracket. Harm is at culpability 1, harm is at category 1, as there are multiple category 2 factors, though again, I must have regard to the position of this case within that upper bracket. That bracket has a starting point of 4 years and a range of between 3 and 4.5 years. Your previous convictions are an aggravating feature to some extent, but I note the age of the majority of them. I do not treat the incitement of others as an aggravating feature, as I've taken that into account when ascribing your role. That you were clearly very intoxicated is an aggravating feature. I take into account your remorse and your recent illness and personal difficulties. The sentence after trial for violent disorder would have been 3 years and 9 months. With credit for a guilty plea, that gives a sentence of 30 months. I reflect your overall conduct that day in the sentence for the violent disorder. I pass sentences of 3 weeks for each assault on an emergency worker, concurrent with each other, and the sentence for the violent disorder. That means that the total sentence is 30 months imprisonment. You'll serve up to half of that sentence before being released on licence. The licence will contain conditions. If you breach those conditions, you'll be liable to serve the remainder of the sentence. If the victim surcharge applies, the order can be drawn up in the appropriate amount, and I make a collection order. You may now go with the dock officers.